collapse is like a car crash. There's kind of a morbid curiosity around it, and those who find it after the fact just can't help but stare. What happened? Who was responsible? Could it happen to me? We can walk through the streets of Rome, Teotihuacan, or Tikal, and collectively think, there but for the grace of God go I. But is collapse inevitable? Is decline actually a choice? Is our society's fate sealed? Well, I don't know about all that, but history does have some encouraging insights on this. Let's dig in. There are a lot of theories of collapse out there, but on this channel, we think Joseph Tainter's model of collapse is essentially the right one. His model has a clear vision of what collapse is, what actually collapses, and why it happens, which, believe it or not, is not something every theory of socio-political collapse actually has. Now, full disclosure, my own dissertation research incorporated Tainter's model, so I'm not exactly an unbiased reporter here. In his 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, he outlines his theory, which we'll cover just briefly. There are a few basic assumptions which I think are pretty reasonable. First, human societies are problem-solving organizations. Second, the socio-political systems that human societies create require energy for their maintenance. Next, increased complexity carries a cost to it, usually in terms of energy. Particularly in historical examples, this means human labor or one of its proxies like money. Now, societies usually invest in the most cost-effective solutions first. But once a problem is solved, the cost for solving it doesn't go away when the problem does. If you don't man the walls, the barbarians will be literally at the gates. So the cost of complexity continues to build as problems get solved. Tainter's final point is drawn from economics. There comes a point where the investment in complexity has a decreasing marginal return on investment, meaning societies reach a point where the cost-effective solutions are gone, and to solve the problems they face, they have to increase in complexity at a high energy cost to solve smaller and smaller problems. It's at this point that societies become fragile and susceptible to collapse, by which we mean a rapid and uncontrolled decrease in an established level of complexity. And while collapse theorists will emphasize that collapse is neither good nor bad, but a system's natural response to inputs devoid of any moral implications, it also comes with immense human suffering, and so we have a vested interest in avoiding it. So, is this the literal arc of civilization, and is every society doomed to hit this point? Are we all totally screwed? Thankfully, Tainter himself doesn't think so. There are strategies to avoid this, and in a series of articles, he documented a case study of one of history's success stories. The Western Roman Empire fell sometime, well, it's a matter of debate when exactly the Western Roman Empire fell, but it ceased to be a coherent political force by the end of the 5th century. However, the Eastern Roman Empire had a larger economy, more human capital, and generally faced different issues than the West, so it survived after the last emperor in the West was deposed. In the late 5th and early 6th century, the Emperor Anastasius instituted a number of economic reforms, including increasing pay to the army. This led to not only a more robust economy, but a professional army filled with local recruits instead of foreign mercenaries. Justinian then inherited a healthy economy and a competent military. He built incredible public works, including the Hagia Sophia. He further reformed the coinage and even set about to reconquer traditional Roman territory. His general Belisarius was able to reclaim North Africa and much of Italy, but these gains were not permanent. In 541 came the first wave of the so-called Plague of Justinian. This was a several-year-long epidemic of bubonic plague which killed as much as a quarter of the population of the Mediterranean basin. This depleted both the tax base and the pool of military recruits. It's unsurprising then that shortly thereafter, North Africa was lost, Italy was mostly lost, and all but a foothold in Spain was gone. And the plague re-emerged in 558 and exacerbated all the problems all over again. From the death of Justinian until the rise of Heraclius in the early 7th century, the empire saw a series of setbacks. The emperor was killed in a mutiny in 602, and capitalizing on this moment of disunity, the Sasanian king invaded and began claiming eastern provinces. To the west, the Lombards had taken back much of Italy. Slavs and Avars raided the Balkans. The coinage was debased so the army could be paid, but it barely helped, and the empire was stretched thin. Heraclius saved the empire from total catastrophe, but even still, Constantinople was put under siege between 618 and 626. Heraclius had to cut the army's pay, silver was taken from the churches to cover costs, and even still the coinage had to be further debased, leading to increased inflation. Heraclius had hard-fought victories against the Sasanians, but these were, again, short-lived. The Rashidun Caliphate surged out of Arabia, first taking the Levantine provinces and then Egypt by 641. They would spread across North Africa and build fleets that would raid the coast of Anatolia and the Aegean for centuries to come. The First Caliphate entered a civil war between 659 and 663, after which the Umayyad Caliphate would emerge, and this brief interlude provided a period of respite for the Eastern Empire. Due to the loss of wealthy and highly populated provinces and a devastated economy, the Emperor Constans II and his successors could not easily pay what soldiers they had. The solutions available to prior emperors were no longer feasible. The coinage could not be further debased without catastrophic outcomes. There was not a large enough tax base to increase taxes on. All of the usual investments in complexity would clearly have marginal returns, and collapse seemed imminent. But in the absence of old solutions, new ones were devised. What the imperial family had was land. And instead of paying a professional army, a new system was organized, called the theme system, where soldiers were given land grant trusts in exchange for hereditary military service. The land still technically belonged to the state, but the soldiers worked it on a hereditary basis. The soldiers' pay was decreased, and they were expected to support themselves through working parcels of land. Warren Treadgold argues it was during Constans II's reign that the first themes were organized, though this is hotly disputed. Whether or not Constans was the progenitor of this plan or not, it seems as though the major reorganization of the empire began around this time. This did a number of things. Military service became hereditary, securing a stable base of soldiers across the empire and virtually eliminating the always unpopular conscription. Armies were now local. They could respond to threats faster and were often more invested in their defense. Soldiers weren't just fighting for some abstract notion of the glory of the empire, but their own land, where their own loved ones and livelihood were. This system also saw the fusion of civil administration and military administration into what were essentially military governors. This drastically reshaped the empire. It was also a drastic reduction in complexity. It decentralized power away from the emperor, and instead of a professional army paid through an empire-wide system of taxation, local governors oversaw issues locally. But it also likely saved the empire. Resistance to invasions increased, and beginning in the middle of the 7th century, you don't really see the caliphate seize more territory on a long-term basis. The defense of the empire became both cheaper and more effective. It also came at a cost. The benefits of the historic increases in complexity began to disappear. Urban areas began to decline in favor of more defensible fortified positions. Literacy rates declined across the empire. It entered a kind of cultural dark age. Also, the reduced centralization of authority meant that power was distributed across the empire, which also meant governors were now more powerful. In the coming centuries, rebellions from charismatic leaders of powerful themes became an increasing issue for the emperors. But despite the costs, the empire was saved. The bleeding was stopped. By 745, the empire successfully invaded into Arab lands. A century later, the empire had nearly doubled in size. By the 10th century, the empire again extended from the Danube to Syria. Under the Macedonian dynasty, art and cultural works were reinvigorated. Literature and the sciences reemerged as scholarly pursuits in academic settings. The empire went from teetering on collapse to the so-called Macedonian Renaissance in only a few centuries. Now, I know that narrative flattens things out quite a bit. There are quite a few more fits and starts between the implementation of the theme system and the Macedonian Renaissance. I skipped a lot. But the general arc holds. The reduction in complexity beginning in the mid-7th century gained the empire several more centuries of vitality before it finally fell in 1453. So is the takeaway we should model our own Byzantine bureaucracy on that of the medieval Eastern Roman Empire? No, that's not exactly what I'm saying. While collapse may not simply be a choice, it is definitely a consequence of an accumulation of policies and decisions, which may be a distinction without a difference. The encouraging takeaway is that collapse is not inevitable. One by one, decisions and policies can be changed. Reduction in complexity is an option, and by looking to history, we have a template to see how it was done and that it worked. Joseph Tainter even notes that reducing in complexity is not the only way to avoid collapse. Complexity comes at an energy cost, so an increase in available energy can reduce the per capita cost of investments in complexity. Basically, a new energy subsidy can hold off collapse for a time. This can come in the form of new populations of people. Historically, this meant conquest and territorial expansion, or it can come in the form of technological innovations. So there isn't just one pathway out of a future headed for collapse. We have the option to begin making decisions that will lead us in a different direction. We can have reasonable discussions around things like deregulation, birth rates, immigration, energy policy, and scientific R&D. Hopefully, no matter how near or far collapse may be, we can move toward our own version of a future Macedonian Renaissance for generations to come.